Tired of yard waste cleanup and the disposal problems caused by closing landfills? Here's great news. It's the new Troy-built Chipper Vac, a breakthrough yard cleanup machine that recycles yard debris as you walk. The powerful yard vac handles leaves and twigs easily, while this auto-feeding chipper takes branches up to 3.5 inches thick. Plus, the Troy-built Chipper Vac bags and reduces all your yard waste for easy disposal or use as free landscape mulch and compost.
Available at Wheeler's Outdoor Power and Equipment, 6575 Northeast 14th Street.
This is CNN.
Live from Washington, Crossfire. On the left, Mike Kinsley. On the right, John Sununu. Tonight, blaming the messenger? In the Crossfire, Jonathan Alter, senior editor of Newsweek magazine, and Wes Pruden, editor-in-chief of the Washington Times.
Good evening. Welcome to Crossfire. After the debate Monday night, Ross Perot lashed out at the media. Yesterday and today, it was George Bush's turn.
You have a debate, you see what you think, and then 2 seconds later, some crackpot comes on and tells you what you think. We don't need that in the United States. You're going to get me in trouble with the media, and who would want to do that? You know my favorite bumper sticker? Annoy the media. Re-elect President Bush.
Is all this press bashing just sour grapes by the guys who are losing in the polls? Or do Bush and Perot have a point? Has the press unfairly crowned Clinton the winner 2 weeks before the vote? Look at the current Newsweek and Monday's New York Post. On the other hand, in October 4 years ago, did George Bush complain about this Newsweek headline? Or this one from Time? And how about this Newsweek cover story before the election in 1984? Well, you must admit, John, so far Newsweek's 2 for 2.
Let's go on to this year. Jonathan Alter, you're the author of that article in Newsweek that was the cover story. Isn't your story and the other coronation stories really just designed to keep the difference between the two candidates from being the news in the last 2 weeks?
No, exactly the opposite. We did exactly what you want, John. We said, what would this guy
be like
me,
Jonathan,
as president? What would this guy be like as president? This was not a horse race cover story about who's going to win. It's a lot of people are supporting him, but they don't have any idea. They're buying a pig in a poke. Here is some informed speculation and guesswork about what it would be like to have Bill Clinton sitting in the Oval Office. That's exactly the thrust of the Republican campaign right now. Story was on that issue.
That story paralleled what the Clinton campaign is trying to do, only talked about a couple of domestic issues and nothing on foreign policy.
No, that story was, if you read it, was quite critical about Clinton's record in Arkansas and raised a number of warning flags about a potential Clinton presidency.
Never talked about foreign policy. Never talked about foreign policy.
Talked about how they create an economic security council and meld foreign and domestic policy more.
And that was the whole thrust of what he would deal, how he would deal with a world that's a very complex world.
In the first 100 days of a Clinton administration, should there be one, the big issue would be, as it was at the beginning of the Reagan administration, the domestic policy package, the economic package.
And you're assuming there's no foreign policy responsibility in the first 100 days?
It's a little harder to predict what crazy dictator is going to pop his head up than it is to look at how a first 100 days might unfold. How can you not like a substantive piece like that, John?
I would love a substantive piece. It's that piece I didn't like. Let's talk a little bit about polls. There's a tendency in the press to try and use polls to steamroller things. Your Washington Post parent company, the company that owns Newsweek, did it in the Wilder race in Virginia. For weeks they were talking about a 10+% Wilder victory. He won by barely a handful of votes, and a lot of people think that folks stayed home because of what the Washington Post did in that whole process. Isn't that the strategy of the poll headlines that we're seeing?
No, I'm not going to defend polls. That's not a strategy. Polls are overused, but at this point in the campaign, the polls are very consistent on the presidential race, and to ignore them is
let's talk about consistency. On September 22nd, Washington Post had a headline with a 21-point Clinton lead. 1 week later, when the lead fell to 9 points, they hit it on page 6.
Well, it didn't fall to 9 points. You have to look at what the bulk of the polls
That's what their stories say.
Well, their poll was out of whack with the other polls. And I didn't see you complaining about it in 1988 when ABC News wrote off Dukakis 3 weeks before the election.
Well, that's Pruden. We don't have to go back to 1988. Memories are very short. Barely a year ago, George Bush was up 70, 80% in the popularity polls, and all the press were saying, this is going to be a landslide for Bush. We might as well cancel the election. The Democrats shouldn't even bother putting up a candidate. Did Wesley Pruden of the Washington Times at that point run an editorial saying, this is biased, this is unfair to the Democrats, this is disgusting, unprofessional behavior? I missed it if you did.
Well, I don't know whether we did or not, but I will tell you that it's very different talking about a president's approval rating more than a year ahead of an election than it is in the last weeks of an election campaign. It's very different. And that Washington Post poll that Governor Sununu referred to, when it showed the drop to 9%, the page 6 story was, the headline on it was, "Drop shows perils of polling." I mean, it was not even about the campaign if you'd read the headline.
The trouble with that, Wes, is that turned out to be exactly right, because that turned out
that's exactly right.
That turned out to be an aberrant poll.
How do you know that that was? That maybe
well,
the others
all
were
we know
aberrant.
is that the ABC Washington Post poll
ABC
had him at what?
7 last week.
Had him at 12, then he went down to 7, then he went back up to 12 the following week. They were correct. That was an aberrant poll that proved the perils of polling. They played that poll exactly
You're
right.
taking the poll that you like. I mean,
no. There was a general trend. There was a general trend in one direction. All of a sudden, a poll comes up that is completely out of whack from the general trend. They ran a piece saying, here's this poll, it's out of whack from the general trend. You guys get all excited, except for the fact they turned out to be right. The general trend returned, including the ABC poll.
We won't know until November 3rd.
Why not carry it on the front page?
You want all polls carried on the front page?
They do it now when they like the numbers. When the Post likes the numbers, they're on the front page.
Matter of fact, you're wrong. The Washington Post decided, I believe they put out a policy after this whole episode saying we're not going to put horse race numbers on the front page anymore.
It'd be a good thing to do.
Also, you said that you think polls are more reliable early on than they are closer to the election.
I didn't say that at all. I said there is a difference in a presidential approval rating 18 months before an election than there is in a presidential poll in the final weeks of the campaign. They're two different animals.
Here's something. How about this? This was in the final weeks of the campaign. This was exactly 4 years ago, late October 1988. Time magazine cover story. Here's how it began. Quote, "The dread moment for a political campaign comes when reporters and sometimes ordinary citizens start asking whether the candidate has already lost and the actual vote has become a mere formality. That nadir arrived for Michael Dukakis early last week." Now, did the Washington Times or Wes Pruden complain about that?
Probably not. But
Why not?
What I did complain about then, I complained about then, and I complain about now, is the slavish reaction, the slavish reliance on polls by the media. It is terrible. This candidate, Bill Clinton, is one of the most unexamined presidential candidates we have ever had because the press went in the tank early. It's just very simple.
How can you say that, Wes?
Let me tell you how.
There has never been a campaign where these questions that you want explored have been explored in depth.
No, they have not. Every time somebody brings up the subject of the draft or the Oxford years or the trip to Moscow, the press monolithically closes and says, oh, that's McCarthyism.
George Bush has monolithically closed and said that is not a relevant issue.
Well, I don't take George Bush as the authority on what's a news story and what's not. Do you think there can be anyone in the country who's interested in politics who is not aware and hasn't had all the information they want about Clinton and the draft? There are many people who don't have all the information they want because he's never told the same story twice. And every time this comes up, the Clinton campaign goes into hysterics. It's so self-evident, I can't see how you argue with it.
Let's talk a little bit about the press going into the tank on the economic issue. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other articles all of a sudden are discovering that the rest of the world is in tough shape and the United States has done a heck of a lot better than they have. Industrial production in the U.S. is up 2%. It's down 7.5% in Japan. When is the last time Newsweek talked about that if the economy is such an important issue?
Rich Thomas wrote an article that President Bush quotes saying some of what you just said. But John...
Rich Thomas of Newsweek.
Of Newsweek. John, if you go to your state, New Hampshire, and you talk to people... This is what happened at the beginning of the year and throughout this year.
In February.
You find people are very worried about the economy. We're not making this up.
Talk about the economy now.
They are very worried about the economy now, and it's not just because the media tells them to be worried about it.
They think that industrial production and manufacturing is down.
It's because their cousin is out of work, and they're worried about getting pink-slipped themselves.
Let's talk about unemployment.
Reality.
Historically, in recessions, we've had double-digit unemployment and breathed a sigh of relief when it came down to 9.
The difference...
We never got over 7.8%, and you and other folks are saying it's the worst employment situation since
presidential
the recession.
Elections are decided in the suburbs, right? And those people are, more of them are out of work. You're right about the numbers, but it is white-collar unemployment now, or white-collar uncertainty. 8 out of 10 think the country is on the wrong track. That's the key poll to look at. In earlier recessions,
the unemployment level
it was a bit snobby.
of white-collar workers is less than the unemployment level has been in other recessions.
White-collar, call it psychology if you want to.
Who creates the psychology?
You're attributing far too much power to the media. If you go out and knock on doors and talk to voters, you find people very worried.
It's time to take a break.
The psychology is a reflection of what people read, and we'll get into that. We'll talk a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about whether or not there might be a public backlash to some of the approach taken by the press.
Respect on your network about my views on agriculture, and not one did I read in any newspaper. Why? Because you're so interested in a poll that might have been coming out, or because somebody had said something nasty about somebody else.
Only to find them back living at home
and the platform
because they can't get
we
work.
built
The world
says
is
it all.
in transition,
The most
and we are
important
feeling that
family
transition
policy,
in our homes. The
urban
defining
policy,
challenge of the 90s
labor
is to
policy,
win the economic
minority
competition,
policy,
to win
and
the peace.
foreign policy.
It's your future they're talking about. If you're under 18, you may not have a vote, but you still have a voice.
Well, we're still at Grand Central Station. We got them lined up, and the Pitney Bowes copier is just pumping them out like a percolator.
My whole world is in this little book.
We've got all kinds of people coming up with all types of copies.
Credit cards.
Make enlargements.
My certification as a skydiver.
This is a conference on self.
Hey, handsome, how you doing?
Secrets.
Thank you.
I'm a therapist, and I've come across a lot of women who have
1,037,421 copies. The Pitney Bowes machine is still up and running, and it's running, well, it's running just like a machine.
What's the coldest place on Earth? The North Pole? The South Pole? No, it's your home the day your heating goes out.
I think we need help. Fast.
Rude is ready to solve your heating problems with reliable Rude products and straight answers. His job's not done until you're comfortable.
Home sweet home.
You can rely on it.
Rely on Rude. 30 years ago this week, the world froze on the threshold of nuclear war, the Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK's Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, on Larry King Live, tonight, 9 Eastern on CNN.
Welcome back to Crossfire. Tonight we're examining the role of the press as it tries to anticipate the results of the election 2 weeks from now. Are they engaging in insightful journalism, or are they forming their own Bill Clinton bandwagon? Our guests tonight are Wes Pruden, editor-in-chief of the Washington Times, and Jonathan Alter, a senior editor of Newsweek, the weekly magazine subsidiary of the Washington Post. Jonathan, you laughed when I said that. You're not ashamed of people identifying Newsweek as part of the Post operation, are you?
No, not in the slightest. I just find it interesting how much you are burying your head in the sand on these economic numbers. And I think you could make a good argument that that's how Bush blew the election, if indeed he did. That he blew it in 1991 when, with all that Desert Storm popularity, he didn't use his political capital for a domestic storm, so he could now argue he was addressing the domestic problem.
Let's go how the press is handled. Let's go and talk to how the press has handled economic news even now. Last week, the press was all scrambling over itself, trying to say how low the increase in Social Security checks were. And the words that some of them were using is that miserly increase was the result of low inflation. If any group wants inflation to be low, it's the elderly. They would like to protect the assets that they have put away for the years. That should have been a good news story. There wasn't anyone in the press that made it a good news story.
Well, low interest rates also hurt the elderly. You can do it fat or,
No, the Social Security increase is directly related.
They said it was caused by inflation and people were free to decide whatever they wanted.
Not with the headlines they gave them, and not with the statements on the evening news.
Wes,
Jonathan,
let's get back to reality.
Well, I'd like to hear what Jonathan has to say about the way the press has an inclination to handle even the best of news in economics as a bad news story.
When it's going bad for you, when it rains, it pours. That's the maximum.
So that's the justification for distortion.
It's not a justification.
That's what you just said.
It's an explanation. If right now the media were to be saying, things are going hunky-dory for George Bush, he's on the way up, look at this great proposal, he had a great week, that would be bias. that would be a distortion of the political
But how
reality
about talking
now
about the
existing in this
specific
country.
news pieces as they come out, with an accuracy rather than a bias?
I think that story was reported accurately.
All right,
Straightforward.
Wes, you know, a lot of this stuff about it's all over, the campaign's over, you might as well forget it, Bill Clinton has won, isn't coming from liberals, it's coming from certified conservatives. That New York Post headline we showed at the beginning of the show, that came from a newspaper that is a solid Republican paper. It was the first off the bat pursuing this Jennifer Flowers story you love so much, and clearly it's not a case of liberal bias, at least in the case of the New York Post, is it?
I don't think I've never thought there was a conspiracy. I think there's a consensus, which is even worse. And I don't care whether it's a Republican paper or a Democratic paper, this concentration on the horse race and declaring the horse race over is a disservice to the readers and viewers. That's the point I would make. And the poll story, the horse race story, is the easiest story in the world to write. And there is a great deal of laziness out there among the political writers.
Wes, I agree with that, but would you agree that Newsweek did not do that in our issue this week?
I thought your story, the one that you wrote that we're referring to, was on balance a good story. I wish that the press had gotten into that a lot earlier. I think that it had I'd like to see more of the foreign policy that the governor's talking about. But on balance, it's the kind of story that the press has not done very much of.
Okay, but Wes, a lot of this stuff, this pessimism that's oozing into the atmosphere is not even from the press at all, liberal or conservative. It comes from, as Meg Greenfield pointed out in her column this week, it comes from Republicans, it comes from people in the Bush campaign, rats deserting a sinking ship. Now, you hang out with these people, you know that's true, isn't it?
Excuse me, I don't hang out with them. I don't hang out with anybody. I stay at the newspaper most of the time. But the point is...
You've run into the occasional Bush campaign official in your travels.
Occasional, that's right.
But and you know that this pessimism is just not a fantasy.
Right. Look, Michael, here's the thing. It doesn't make any difference where the people are oozing out from. It's the press responsibility to go after the story wherever it is. And why should we put this emphasis on the rats leaving the sinking ship, as you put it, unless we were trying to create a stampede?
Now, that is a great story.
It's the stampede story.
Is that not a great... You're saying... what kind of a newspaper man are you?
Oh,
you mean to say if your reporters came to you and said, I have a great story, people in the Clinton campaign are bad-mouthing Clinton, they say he's sure to lose, they're looking for other jobs, you would say, nah, that's a rats deserting a sinking ship story, we're not interested in it.
This very thing came up this afternoon when our lead story for tomorrow morning has some of that in it, that the Republican campaigners are leaving the sinking ship.
It's a good story,
It's a good story, but the instructions were, that's part of the story, but that is not the emphasis of the story.
Well, that hasn't been the emphasis of the coverage. That was Meg Greenfield wrote a column.
Over the last few days, it's been a stampede. It's been a virtual stampede in the media the last few days.
There was one story in the style section of the Washington Post and one column on their op-ed page. That's all I've seen in what you regard as an extremely liberal newspaper.
Let me get to the fundamentals.
Press does it, too.
Let me get to some of the fundamentals.
Thousands of AP stories. They do one story like this. Is that wrong?
The tone of much of the AP coverage for the last few days has been the hopelessness of the Republican cause. It just happens to be true.
Look, it's one of your guys, Bill.
Not a liberal bias in the press?
I think that one would be lying to say that most reporters are not more liberal than most Americans. You're quite right about that. But they will go for a good story before an ideological story 99 times out of 100. All you have to do is look at...
That's the legend you'd like to create.
Look at the comparative coverage of Ronald Reagan.
It doesn't happen that way.
Of Jimmy Carter, terrible press, and Ronald Reagan, much more favorable press, and you shatter the ideological bias idea.
You're both right, and here's why. It is true that most reporters that I know about are liberals, but it is also true that there is no conspiracy to put a liberal bias on it. But the problem is that the media, the reporters in the media, tend to write for each other. They have become an elite. Not a cultural elite necessarily, but an elite. They talk to each other, and when they say, no, everybody I talk to is for Clinton, they're telling the truth.
Are you saying no president, no man has ever won the presidency when he has been this far behind in the polls at this point? Maybe that's being overplayed, underplayed, I don't know. Are you saying that's not an interesting story? That's not a fact that the American people have a right to know?
Of course it is, but it's not. Should not be the story.
Well, I don't think it is. Anyway, when we come back, I'm going to try out on these guys, these media critics, my theory about the press conspiracy of this election.
Hello, I'm Susan Rook. At the top of the hour, some families get word in the fate of their loved ones missing in Vietnam. We will have a live report from the Pentagon. Also, disabled people are claiming the Bush administration is deliberately not doing enough to help them. And in London, tens of thousands of angry British coal miners march to keep their jobs. Hope you join us for Prime News right after Crossfire.
Ethan Allen introduces the American Dimensions Collection. Eclectic and most agreeably priced. For people who really love to live at home. Right now, there's a sale going on at your local Ethan Allen.
You probably wonder why so many people deposit money with a bank like us.
We sure do.
Well, when it comes to money market yields, ours are right up there.
Oldie has money market funds that paid higher yields.
Open an IRA with our bank, and we'll put your money in long-term CDs.
With Oldie, you can invest for growth and high yields.
So, there's only one place to keep your savings in IRA.
Right. Oldie, America's full-service discount broker.
Yeah, my plane was 3 hours late last night.
Late? What about our presentation?
I'm all set.
But we made changes after you left.
Yeah, Jim faxed them to me.
And you made the changes?
On all 20 copies.
At that time of night? Well, how about the charts?
Done.
And the transparencies?
In color. Everything's bound and ready.
That's great. But how'd you do it?
Connections.
Connections? What connections?
Kinko's, your branch office 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
I was already late for my meeting when my flight landed. Lucky for me, someone left a courtesy car. I had to get the dollar rent-a-car fast. I knew they were right on the airport with low rates.
Welcome to Dollar.
Hello, I have a car rental reservation.
No problem. I'll just punch it up on the computer. Dollar Rent-A-Car is right on the airport, right on the money, with over 1,000 locations around the world. Call your travel consultant or Dollar at 1-800-800-4000.
Now you can go for fish, tender chicken, and shrimp to go from Long John Silver's.
You're gonna get your wish. Hey, hey.
Go fish! You're on.
Long John Silver's to go.
Wesley Pruden, in my nuts, what I see the media doing is exactly the opposite of what you say. I see them keeping an artificial suspense going because that's in their institutional interest. If the race is all over, David Broder, Jonathan Alter, we all have nothing to write about.
Well, I don't think you're nuts necessarily, but I think you're wrong. I don't think they're keeping artificial suspense up. I think that there is a herd mentality, pack mentality, whatever you want to call it, that has decided that the race is over. We finally got Bill Clinton, a good Democrat, or if not a good Democrat, a Democrat in, and that's the story. And it feeds on itself. Nobody tells the reporters this is our story for the day. But because they talk to each other,
am I nuts? I haven't read several stories about how George Bush can still do it. Here's the scenario. Here's what states. Here's what strategies, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, you read those stories, but they're cast in the way that if you believe in fairy tales, this is how George Bush could do it.
In terms of American history, that's true. This would be the greatest upset by a long shot in American history. Truman was only behind by 5 points at this time. Other underdogs who came were behind about
Reagan was behind at this time, too.
Much less, a third of what Bush is
Jonathan,
behind.
you've been trying to tell me that even though you acknowledge the press is liberal, that it doesn't creep into their writing, and it doesn't creep into the way the stories are presented. But even that liberal press corps will come to me when I've complained about headlines and said that liberal headline wasn't part of their story. It was imposed by the editors, the management that's there.
So sometimes it'll creep in. I'm not going to tell you it never does. The main point, it seems to me, is that we want to move away from this kind of horse race coverage to a more analytical coverage that sometimes can have some political dimensions to it, but takes risks in trying to ask the most important question.
Pruden is an editor. But it doesn't go with the music.
The most important question. It is, how would he govern?
No, that's the most important question the day after the election. But until the election, the important question is, what's his policies and what's the president's policies?
You have to make an assessment of what this guy would be like in the Oval Office for Bush, Perot, and Clinton.
All right. You enough advertising for Newsweek. Thanks, Jonathan Alter. Thanks, Wesley Pruden. Media critic John Sununu and I will be back in just a moment.
You know where I'm going tomorrow?
Where?
I'm flying all the way to Asia.
Can our plane fly there?
Well, maybe if you throw it real hard, it just might.
When you have business on the other side of the world, choose the airline that just cut up to 3 hours off your travel time to cities throughout Asia. With service to more Asian cities than any other U.S. airline, Northwest Airlines, the leading airline to Asia. Some people just know how to fly.
No matter what our beliefs or where we come from, chances are if we fly, we do it on an airplane made by Boeing.
This man just woke up in a Residence Inn hotel room. What are his options? He can A, make a cup of fresh coffee in the kitchen. B, walk all the way over to the living room area and start a fire in the fireplace. Or C, shoot some hoops. Okay, let's see what he does. D, none of the above. Residence Inn by Marriott. No other hotel gives you more for less.
James Stockdale. What does he stand for? And why is he running? In a one-on-one interview, find out why this former military man has decided to enter the political arena. Stockdale, Perot's VP. Tonight at 10:30 Eastern on CNN.
For a transcript, send $5 to Journal Graphics Incorporated, 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado, 80203, or call 303-831-9000.
John, were you serious in what you said just at the end, that you think the time to run a story about what a Clinton presidency would be like is not before the election when people can make up their minds, but after the election when it's too late?
The time to run the article that says it is a Clinton presidency is after the election.
That's not what it said, John. You don't understand anything about journalism. As Wesley Pruden should have explained to you, an editor, it's a constitutional right of every reporter to blame the headline on the editor.
Michael, you guys squeal every time somebody points out that you're liberal bias. You ought to accept credit for having given Clinton a big lead. Be proud of what you've done.
Clinton has a lead because people have seen him and they like him, and they've seen George Bush and they don't like him. And don't be a sour grape for blaming the press for everything.
Bias.
Oh, please. From the left, I'm Mike Kinsley. Good night for Crossfire.
And from the right, I'm John Sununu. Join us again tomorrow night for another edition of Crossfire.
Prime News is next, and here's Bernard Shaw with a totally unbiased look at what's coming up. Bernie?
Thank you, Michael. You're quite correct. Coming up next, a report on new information from Vietnam and what it means to families of missing servicemen. The State Department backpedals on whether U.S. equipment made its way to an Iraqi nuclear facility, and the latest weapon in the fight against drunk drivers. Those stories and more on Prime News next.
Coming up, Prime News, followed by Larry King Live after a word from your local cable system here on CNN.
The fresh new country music on KJJY isn't the same old stuff. Welcome to the 90s.
I like a man who will lay down beside me. That walk right back to me. But I'd have had to miss the
New country music and all your country favorites on 92.5 KJJY.
For 6 years, I was chlorine dependent, forever testing the water, adding chemicals. I didn't own the pool. The pool owned me. Then a worried friend said, chlorine-free Baquacil. It turns out Baquacil does the same job in a fraction of the time. A few minutes on Saturday morning, and I'm free for the week. With Baquacil, pools can be fun. And so can I.
See your authorized dealer for chlorine-free Baquacil.
Another new car? What'd you get tired of the old color? No, we get a new car every 2 years.